John Mercer woke up every morning at 6, his routine precise and unyielding. He would brew his coffee, toast his bread to exactly the right shade of golden brown, and check his phone for the day's news. To anyone who knew him, John seemed calm, methodical, even ordinary. But underneath that controlled exterior, a tension quietly simmered, a need for order that nothing could disturb. His wife, Linda, moved through life differently. She was cheerful, spontaneous, and often laughed at John's tiny quirks. Friends described her as warm and caring, someone who could brighten a room without trying. Their marriage appeared balanced, John providing stability, Linda adding color, but the truth beneath the surface was far more fragile. John loved burgers more than he cared to admit. Every Tuesday, he would drive to the same diner downtown, order his favorite double cheeseburger with extra pickles, and treat himself as though the meal were sacred. It wasn't just about taste. It was ritual, predictability, a piece of the world that he could control entirely. He had told no one precisely how much he looked forward to these Tuesdays, not even Linda, though she often playfully teased him about it. Most days, it was easy to laugh off her jokes. But on the day everything changed, John's obsession would become his undoing. It started like any other ordinary evening. John returned home from work, the sun already dipping behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the suburban street. The house was quiet. He hung up his coat, set his briefcase down carefully, and walked toward the kitchen, imagining the moment he would unwrap his prized burger. But when he opened the refrigerator, the tray where his burger should have been was empty. A chill ran through him. He searched the counter, the pantry, even the trash can, but the burger had vanished. Linda appeared from the living room, holding a mug of tea. She smiled at him, her expression light, as though nothing had happened. John's hands trembled slightly as he asked her about the burger. She shrugged, still smiling, admitting casually that she had eaten it. It wasn't meant to provoke him, but in John's mind, it felt like betrayal. A simple, ordinary act, eating his burger, suddenly became a violation, a disregard for the one thing he held sacred that day. As evening deepened, a storm of frustration and disbelief built inside John. He could feel his heart racing, the warmth of anger creeping from his chest into his hands and face. Memories of other small irritations flickered in his mind, missed deadlines at work, neighbors making noise, minor domestic disputes he had brushed aside. Tonight, all of them converged on this single point, the missing burger. Linda, unaware of the intensity of his reaction, laughed softly at the situation. That laugh, meant to soothe, only fueled the fire inside John. He moved through the house with a tension that could almost be felt in the walls themselves, the ordinary evening twisting toward something neither of them could yet see coming. By the time night fell, the air in the Mercer household was thick with unease. The missing burger was no longer just food, it was a symbol of broken expectations, of control lost. Outside, the suburban street remained peaceful, unaware that within one quiet home, something fragile had cracked. The night stretched on, ordinary in appearance but charged with the kind of silent tension that precedes tragedy. The morning after the missing burger, John woke with a restless energy he could not explain. His sleep had been restless, fragmented by dreams he barely remembered but that left him tense and irritable. He went through the motions of his routine, but nothing felt right. The house, which had always been a sanctuary of order, now seemed chaotic, every small detail slightly off, as if conspiring against him. Linda moved around him with her usual calm, humming softly as she prepared breakfast, but John could barely notice. His thoughts kept returning to the burger, to the way it had disappeared without warning, and to the casual way Linda had dismissed it. He tried to push the anger down, to remind himself it was trivial, that it was only a burger. But the more he tried, the stronger the feeling grew. Every small sound, the ticking of the clock, the rustling of paper, the distant hum of cars outside, felt amplified, intrusive, almost mocking. He stared at Linda across the kitchen, at her serene expression, and a strange, suffocating resentment began to build. He remembered other times he had felt powerless or overlooked, small humiliations stacked like invisible bricks over the years. They all converged into this moment, and suddenly the absence of a single burger seemed like the final, intolerable affront. John left the house briefly, walking the familiar streets of the neighborhood to clear his mind. The crisp air should have calmed him, but it did not. Every passerby, every dog barking in the distance, seemed to intensify his irritation. He imagined the burger, perfectly stacked, waiting for him, only to vanish. His mind spun through scenarios, each more obsessive than the last. By the time he returned home, a quiet resolve had settled over him, a grim determination that something must be done to restore control. Linda greeted him with her usual warmth, unaware of the storm that had taken root in his mind. She had no way of knowing that what had begun as a small domestic annoyance had grown into a dangerous, overwhelming fixation. She went about her day, tending to chores and smiling when John glanced her way, completely oblivious to the dark thoughts now occupying him. John's gaze followed her, calculating, internalizing every movement, every small gesture. The ordinary actions of daily life became loaded with meaning, feeding the tension that had been building since the missing burger. By evening, John's agitation had reached a breaking point. The house felt suffocating, every shadow heavy, every sound sharp. He moved through rooms almost mechanically, rehearsing thoughts he could not voice, imagining outcomes that were terrifying in their intensity. The missing burger had become a symbol, but it was no longer about food, it was about control, about order disrupted, about a life that suddenly seemed fragile and unpredictable. Linda, still unaware, continued with her evening routine, setting the table, humming softly. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards, and the racing pulse in John's mind. Outside, neighbors settled in for a normal evening, unaware that within the Mercer home, tension had coiled into something dangerous. By nightfall, the ordinary domestic peace had been shattered, replaced by a silent, invisible storm. John's thoughts were now focused, chillingly so, on what must happen to restore what he believed had been lost. The tension was palpable, a slow-moving, inevitable pressure, as though the house itself held its breath, waiting for the moment that would change everything forever. The evening stretched on, heavy and still, as John Mercer's thoughts became sharper, darker, and more urgent. Every ordinary noise in the house seemed amplified, Linda moving in the living room, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft tapping of rain against the windows. The missing burger, which had seemed trivial only days before, had transformed in John's mind into a symbol of disrespect, of chaos invading the carefully controlled order of his life. The anger he had suppressed all day now pulsed through him like electricity, uncontainable and dangerous. John's movements became deliberate, almost mechanical, as he walked through the house. He avoided Linda's gaze at first, but the tension between them was palpable. Every gesture she made, every step she took, seemed to him a reminder of what he had lost, and the world outside the house, friends, neighbors, even his workplace, faded from importance. All that mattered now was the breach of control, the disruption of his expectation, and the overwhelming need to assert dominance over the situation. He remembered the gun tucked away in the bedroom drawer, a weapon he had purchased months earlier, claiming it was for protection. Until now, it had been nothing more than a precaution, a quiet insurance against danger. But tonight, in the stillness of the home and the weight of his anger, it became something else, a tool, a solution, a way to reclaim what had been taken from him. The thought of using it sent a shiver through him, yet it was accompanied by a strange sense of clarity, a cold logic that made the act feel inevitable. Linda continued with her evening routine, oblivious to the storm brewing just feet away. She washed dishes, arranged the living room, and hummed softly, her trust in John absolute, her love unquestioned. The contrast between her calm and his growing obsession made the tension even more unbearable. Each moment that passed without resolution felt like an eternity. John's mind cycled through scenarios again and again, each one more precise than the last. In his obsession, time itself seemed to bend around the inevitability he had convinced himself was necessary. When he finally approached the bedroom, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted the gun. There was no hesitation. The act had been rehearsed countless times in his mind, and yet the finality of it was terrifying in its simplicity. He moved silently, methodically, every step bringing him closer to the point where his anger, his sense of betrayal, and his need for control would collide in the most irreversible way. The house seemed to hold its breath, the shadows stretching long and dark, as if anticipating what was about to happen. The moment came swiftly. The gun discharged, shattering the quiet and the normalcy of the house in a single, irreversible instant. Linda fell, her life ending in a sudden, violent rupture. The sound echoed, a sharp punctuation to years of suppressed tension, small resentments, and obsessive control. Outside, the neighborhood remained unaware, the ordinary night continuing as if nothing had changed, while inside, the Mercer home became a scene of horror and tragedy, marking the point where a seemingly trivial dispute escalated into a life-ending catastrophe. John Mercer sat in the living room, the house silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. He had been pacing for hours, his mind consumed by the absence of the burger, a trivial event that had grown into something much larger in his thoughts. Each passing moment made the loss feel more personal, more deliberate, as though the world itself had conspired against him. His chest tightened, and a sharp heat rose in his face. Linda moved about the kitchen, humming softly, completely unaware of the storm gathering just steps away. Her calm, so ordinary and gentle, only fueled the fire inside John, intensifying the sense that order had been shattered. He thought about the gun tucked away in the bedroom drawer. He had bought it months ago for protection, never imagining it would be used in the way he now considered. But in the quiet of the house, with the shadows stretching long across the walls, the weapon became a symbol of control, a solution to the problem he could not bear. The anger and frustration that had built up over the missing burger now demanded a physical outlet, and his mind fixated on the idea of reclaiming authority, of restoring a balance that existed only in his perception. John moved deliberately, each step measured, his thoughts racing in cold, precise calculations. The living room and kitchen blurred around him as he focused solely on Linda, on the act he had convinced himself he must commit. He watched her wash the dishes, the motion of her hands casual, unknowing, and the intensity of his fixation grew. In his mind, the simple act of eating the burger had become a personal attack, an insult he could not forgive, a breach that demanded action. The mundane household sounds, running water, the clatter of utensils, even the tick of the clock, echoed in his ears as if marking the countdown to the inevitable. By the time he reached the bedroom, the tension had coiled so tightly within him that his entire body shook, but his movements remained deliberate. The gun felt cold in his hands, heavy with a sense of finality he could not ignore. Every thought that had led to this moment, the frustrations of daily life, the minor slights, the obsessive need for control, condensed into one singular, terrifying clarity. Outside, the street was quiet, unaware of the act about to unfold, while inside, the Mercer home held its breath, a silent witness to the breaking point of a man's obsession. The discharge was sudden and violent. A single gunshot pierced the quiet, leaving an echoing void in its wake. Linda collapsed immediately, the life that had seemed so ordinary moments ago extinguished in an instant. The sound shattered the house, but outside, the suburban street remained oblivious, the world continuing as if nothing had happened. In that instant, years of tension, anger, and obsession found their irreversible release, leaving behind only silence and devastation. The ordinary had become extraordinary in its horror, a simple domestic dispute transformed into a tragic act that would forever haunt those who would come after. The police arrived at the Mercer house within minutes of the gunshot being reported, but by then the damage was done. The scene inside was chilling in its stillness. Linda lay motionless on the floor, and John sat in the living room, staring blankly at the walls as if the act he had committed belonged to someone else. Detectives moved carefully, noting every detail, the position of the body, the discarded dishes in the kitchen, and the gun resting nearby. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, just the remnants of a quiet domestic life shattered in an instant. Neighbors, drawn by the sound of the shot, gathered on the street, whispering in disbelief. No one could understand how something so ordinary, something as simple as a missing burger, could lead to this level of violence. Forensic teams combed the house for evidence. Fingerprints, residue, and photographs documented every angle of the scene. They found traces of fast food on the counter, confirming the story John would later give about the missing burger. But even with proof of motive, the case felt surreal. The detectives pieced together the timeline from surveillance footage from nearby stores and traffic cameras. They watched John leave work, his routine unremarkable, then return home in a tense and agitated state. Each frame seemed ordinary, yet every movement gained a new, sinister meaning once they knew the outcome. Psychologists were brought in to analyze John's behavior. Reports indicated long-standing obsessive tendencies and anger issues that had never manifested in violence before. Friends and family spoke of him as meticulous, controlling, and often irritable over minor disruptions, but nothing had prepared them for this. The experts concluded that the missing burger was a trigger, not the cause. It was the spark that lit a fire long smoldering beneath the surface. John's need for control, combined with suppressed anger and an obsessive mind, created the perfect storm for tragedy. Interviews with neighbors revealed subtle warning signs. Some recalled arguments between John and Linda that had seemed trivial at the time, a raised voice over a misplaced item, a frustrated glare over small domestic matters, but no one had thought them dangerous. The investigation painted a portrait of a man whose compulsions and frustrations had quietly escalated, unnoticed until it was too late. Detectives slowly began to understand that the crime was not impulsive in the traditional sense, it was the result of a mind fixated on perceived betrayal, driven to extreme measures by a convergence of internal pressures. As the evidence mounted, the reality of the situation became clear. John Mercer had crossed a line from which there was no return. The investigation would ultimately reveal not just a murder, but a cautionary tale about obsession, control, and how seemingly insignificant events can become catalysts for unimaginable tragedy. The quiet suburban neighborhood, once safe and ordinary, would never be the same. In the aftermath, the Mercer house stood as a stark reminder of how quickly order can collapse, and how a single moment of anger, combined with long-standing psychological tension, could end a life in an instant. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as John Mercer's case began. Reporters crowded the hallways, capturing every detail of a story that had gripped the nation. Outside, neighbors whispered about the tragedy that had struck their quiet street, still trying to reconcile the image of a man who seemed ordinary with the horror of what he had done. Inside, the trial unfolded slowly, each day revealing new layers of a life spiraling toward violence. The missing burger, at first so trivial, became the defining moment in the narrative, a symbol of the obsessive control and simmering anger that had led to murder. The prosecution laid out the sequence of events with meticulous detail. They described the morning John returned home, the discovery of the missing burger, and the escalating tension that followed. Surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and witness statements all pointed to premeditation, painting a chilling portrait of a man whose obsession had reached its breaking point. Psychologists testified about John's controlling tendencies and obsessive behavior, explaining how a minor domestic conflict could escalate into a deadly act. Each detail seemed ordinary at first glance, yet together they created an image of inevitability, a slow march toward tragedy that no one had intervened to stop. The defense argued that John's actions were impulsive, the result of a sudden lapse in judgment brought on by intense frustration. They emphasized the triviality of the trigger, a missing burger, and tried to frame the crime as a momentary loss of control rather than premeditated intent. Yet the evidence contradicted this narrative. The careful movements, the retrieval of the gun, the methodical approach, all pointed to a deliberate act, a man acting on obsession rather than impulse. The jury listened quietly, the weight of the evidence pressing on them as they absorbed the story of a life undone by seemingly small frustrations magnified beyond reason. Family and friends of Linda attended each session, their grief palpable. They shared stories of her warmth, her humor, and the life that had been stolen in an instant. Their testimonies brought human depth to the case, a stark contrast to the cold calculations of John's actions. Each account reinforced the tragedy, emphasizing how quickly ordinary life had turned into catastrophe. The courtroom seemed suspended between the everyday and the horrific, a place where grief and obsession collided in stark relief. When the verdict was finally delivered, John Mercer was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was harsh, reflecting both the brutality of the act and the dangerous psychology behind it. Outside, the media frenzy continued, but within the Mercer household, the story had ended in silence. Linda's absence left a void that could never be filled, and the case became a lasting cautionary tale. It was a reminder of how fragile normalcy can be, how obsession and unresolved anger can transform a single trivial event into irreversible tragedy. The quiet neighborhood would never forget, and the story of a man who shot his wife over a burger became a haunting example of how obsession can destroy everything in its path.